Have you ever trusted someone with your whole heart, only to have them look you straight in the eye and try to take everything you've worked for? Have you ever experienced that gut-wrenching moment when you realize the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are actually plotting against you? Well, let me tell you about the day I discovered my own family was trying to legally steal my house from me, and how one single piece of paper changed everything. This isn't just a story about property or money. This is about betrayal, heartbreak, and the devastating realization that blood doesn't always mean loyalty. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what matters is what happened to me. And I'm sharing this because I know I'm not alone. I know there are others out there who have felt this same crushing weight of family betrayal. And if you're one of them, I want you to know that you're not crazy, you're not ungrateful, and you're not alone. So please stick with me through this journey, because what I'm about to share might save you from making the same mistakes I did, or it might just help you feel less alone in your own struggle. Before I dive into the nightmare that became my reality, let me paint you a picture of who I was before all of this happened. I was the kind of person who believed in family above everything else. I was raised with those traditional values that family comes first, that you always support your relatives no matter what, and that blood is thicker than water. My grandmother, bless her soul, was the matriarch of our family. She was this incredible woman who held everyone together with her wisdom, her cooking, and her unconditional love. I spent countless afternoons at her house, listening to her stories, helping her in the garden, and learning what she believed were the most important lessons in life. She would always tell me that family was everything, that we had to stick together through thick and thin, and that one day, when she was gone, we would all need to be there for each other. I believed every word she said. I trusted that belief with everything in me. Growing up, our family seemed close, or at least that's what I thought. There were the usual disagreements and little arguments, sure, but nothing that ever seemed serious. We had holiday dinners together, celebrated birthdays, and showed up for each other during tough times. My siblings and I, we had our moments of rivalry like any kids do, but I always thought that underneath it all, there was genuine love and respect. I was close to my parents, or so I believed. My mother was always nurturing, always checking in on me, always interested in my life. My father was the strong, silent type, but I never doubted his love for me. And my siblings, well, we had grown apart as we got older, and our lives took different directions, but I still considered them my best friends, the people who knew me better than anyone else in the world. I had built my entire identity around being a good family member, a loyal daughter, a supportive sister. Little did I know that this very identity would become my greatest vulnerability. The story really begins about 3 years ago when my grandmother passed away. It was devastating for all of us, or at least I thought it was devastating for all of us. She had been sick for a while, and we all knew it was coming, but nothing really prepares you for that final goodbye. I remember holding her hand in those last days, telling her how much she meant to me, promising her that I would take care of the family like she had always done. She smiled at me with those kind, tired eyes and squeezed my hand weakly. In those final moments, I felt like I was being entrusted with something precious, something sacred. I had no idea that this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy everything I believed about the people I loved most. After the funeral, we all gathered at my parents' house for the reading of the will. I wasn't expecting much, to be honest. My grandmother wasn't wealthy by any means, but she had lived a comfortable life and had managed to save some money over the years. More than anything, I was just sad, grieving, not really thinking about inheritances or possessions. The lawyer, an elderly man who had known my grandmother for decades, opened the will and began reading. There were small bequests to various family members, some jewelry for my mother, some savings bonds for my siblings, and then he came to the big item, the house. My grandmother's house, the place where I had spent so much of my childhood, where so many memories lived in every corner, was being left to me, just me. Not to be divided among the siblings, not to my parents, but specifically to me. I felt my heart skip a beat. The lawyer explained that my grandmother had left specific instructions. She wanted me to have the house because, in her words written right there in the will, I was the one who had always been there for her, who had shown up consistently, who had cared for her without expecting anything in return. She wrote that she knew I would cherish the house and keep it in the family, that I would maintain it with love and respect. I was overwhelmed with emotion, tears streaming down my face, feeling honored and heartbroken all at once. This was her final gift to me, her way of saying thank you, her way of showing that she had seen and appreciated everything I had done for her. I looked around the room at my family, expecting to see happy faces, maybe some tears of joy for me, some acknowledgement of this incredible gesture from our beloved grandmother. Instead, what I saw made my blood run cold. The expressions on their faces were not what I expected at all. My mother's face had gone pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. My father looked stunned, almost angry. My siblings, they weren't even trying to hide their shock and what I can only describe as rage. My older brother stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. My younger sister's eyes narrowed, and I could see her jaw clenching. The room, which had been filled with the sounds of quiet grief just moments before, suddenly felt charged with tension, thick and suffocating. Nobody said congratulations. Nobody hugged me. Nobody seemed happy for me at all. The lawyer, sensing the shift in atmosphere, quickly finished reading the rest of the will and excused himself, practically fleeing from the uncomfortable situation. As soon as he left, the room erupted. My brother was the first to speak, his voice loud and accusatory. He demanded to know what I had done to manipulate grandmother, what lies I had told her, how I had tricked an old woman into giving me her most valuable asset. I was so shocked I couldn't even form words. My sister joined in, saying it wasn't fair, that the house should be divided equally among all of us, that I had always been grandmother's favorite and had clearly taken advantage of that. My mother, who I had always seen as gentle and kind, looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something cold and calculating. She said quietly that this wasn't what grandmother would have really wanted, that she must have been confused in her final days, that the will should be contested. My father said nothing, but his silence felt like a betrayal all on its own. I tried to defend myself, tried to explain that I had no idea this was going to happen, that I had never asked for the house, that I was just as surprised as they were. But my words fell on deaf ears. They had already made up their minds. In their eyes, I had become the enemy, the manipulator, the thief who had stolen their inheritance. This woman who they claimed to love so much, whose memory they claimed to cherish, suddenly her final wishes meant nothing to them because those wishes didn't benefit them the way they wanted. I left that house that day feeling like I had entered the twilight zone. Everything I thought I knew about my family had been shattered in the span of an hour. The people who were supposed to celebrate with me, support me, be happy that our grandmother had thought so highly of me, had instead turned on me with a viciousness I didn't know they possessed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of that awful day. I questioned everything. Had I somehow manipulated my grandmother without realizing it? Was I really the villain they were making me out to be? But deep down, I knew the truth. I had loved my grandmother purely, without any ulterior motives. I had spent time with her because I genuinely enjoyed her company, not because I expected anything in return. The house was her choice, her decision, and she had made it clearly and legally. But knowing the truth didn't make the pain any less excruciating. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were right, but everyone around you was telling you that you were wrong? Comment below and let me know, because that's exactly where I found myself, and it was one of the loneliest feelings I've ever experienced. The weeks following the will reading were some of the darkest of my life. The house that my grandmother had left me suddenly felt less like a gift and more like a curse, a source of constant anxiety and conflict. I didn't move into it right away because I was still living in my own apartment and needed time to figure out what to do. The property was beautiful, a modest 3-bedroom home in a nice neighborhood that had appreciated significantly in value over the years. It wasn't a mansion by any means, but in our city's real estate market, it was worth a substantial amount of money. I later learned that this was part of what fueled my family's anger. They saw dollar signs where I saw memories. During this time, I tried reaching out to my siblings individually, hoping that away from the group dynamics and our parents' influence, we could talk reasonably about what had happened. I called my brother first, the one I had always looked up to growing up. When he finally answered after several ignored calls, his voice was cold, so different from the warm, protective big brother I had known all my life. He told me point blank that if I had any decency, I would sell the house and split the money equally among all the siblings. When I tried to explain that I wanted to honor grandmother's wishes, that maybe we could work something out where the house stayed in the family but they could visit anytime, he cut me off. He said I was being selfish and greedy, that I had always been grandmother's pet and had finally shown my true colors. Then he hung up on me. I sat there holding my phone, tears streaming down my face, unable to believe that this was really happening. My sister was even worse. When I tried to meet her for coffee to talk things through, she agreed, but then ambushed me with our mother. The two of them sat across from me in that coffee shop, and for an hour they tag-teamed me with accusations and guilt trips. My mother kept saying how disappointed grandmother would be to see the family torn apart like this, completely ignoring the irony that they were the ones doing the tearing. My sister brought up every perceived slight from our childhood. Every time she thought grandmother had favored me, every moment she had felt less loved. It was like years of buried resentment had suddenly erupted, and I was the target for all of it. She actually told me that I had ruined the family, that holidays would never be the same, and that it was all my fault. I tried to defend myself, tried to make them see reason, but it was like talking to brick walls. They had constructed this narrative where I was the villain, and nothing I said could change their minds. What hurt the most was realizing that this wasn't really about the house at all. This was about years of hidden jealousies and competitions that I hadn't even known existed. In their minds, grandmother choosing to leave the house to me was the ultimate proof that she had loved me more than them, and they couldn't handle that reality. So instead of dealing with their own feelings of inadequacy or examining their own relationships with grandmother, they decided to blame me, to make me the problem. It was easier to hate me than to look inward at themselves. The harassment didn't stop with those confrontations. My phone became a source of constant stress. I would receive text messages at all hours from different family members, some trying to guilt me, others outright threatening. My aunt, my mother's sister, sent me a long message about how I had dishonored the family and broken my grandmother's heart by causing this division, again completely ignoring that I hadn't caused anything. I had simply accepted a gift that was freely given to me. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had opinions about my character and my intentions. The family group chat that had once been full of funny memes and updates about everyone's lives became a toxic cesspool of passive-aggressive comments and thinly veiled insults directed at me. I eventually had to mute it because seeing the notifications would make my heart race with anxiety. My parents stopped inviting me to family dinners. When I asked my mother about it, she said it would be too uncomfortable for everyone if I was there, that I should understand why they needed space from me. The message was clear. I was no longer welcome in my own family unless I gave up my inheritance. I felt like I was being emotionally blackmailed, held hostage by their conditional love. Either I did what they wanted, or I was out. There was no room for discussion, no acknowledgement of my feelings or grandmother's wishes, just their demands and my expected compliance. I spent countless nights crying myself to sleep, wondering how my life had turned into such a nightmare. I would look at old family photos and wonder if any of it had been real. Had they ever truly loved me? Or had I always just been convenient to have around? Were all those happy memories tainted now by this revelation of their true characters? I started seeing a therapist because I honestly didn't know how to cope with what was happening. I was grieving my grandmother, dealing with a sudden inheritance I wasn't prepared for, and simultaneously losing my entire family. The therapist helped me understand that what I was experiencing was a form of family abuse, that their behavior was manipulative and toxic, and that I had every right to feel hurt and betrayed. She encouraged me to set boundaries and to remember that accepting a gift that was legally and rightfully mine didn't make me a bad person. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two very different things. During one particularly low moment, I actually considered giving in to their demands. I thought about calling a realtor, listing the house, and just splitting the money to make peace. I even went so far as to drive to grandmother's house one evening, standing in the driveway and looking at the home that held so many precious memories. I remembered learning to bake cookies in that kitchen, remembered reading books on that front porch, remembered the sound of grandmother's laughter echoing through those rooms. And then I imagined selling it, watching strangers move in, erasing all those memories and replacing them with their own lives. I imagined grandmother looking down and seeing me give up on her final wish, abandoning what she had entrusted me with simply because it was hard to stand up for myself. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized that giving in wouldn't actually bring peace. My family had shown me who they really were, and even if I gave them the money, they would never respect me. They would see me as weak, as someone who could be bullied and manipulated, and more importantly, I would lose respect for myself. I would spend the rest of my life knowing that I had let them bully me into betraying my grandmother's trust. So I made a decision that night, standing in that driveway with tears on my cheeks and determination in my heart. I was going to keep the house. I was going to honor my grandmother's wishes. And I was going to fight for what was legally and morally mine, no matter what it cost me. The decision to stand my ground brought me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in weeks, but it also brought escalation from my family that I wasn't prepared for. Within days of me making it clear that I wasn't going to sell the house, the harassment intensified dramatically. My brother started showing up at my apartment unannounced, pounding on my door and demanding to talk to me. The first time it happened, I was so startled I opened the door, thinking maybe he had come to apologize or at least have a civil conversation. Instead, he pushed his way inside and started yelling at me, calling me names I won't repeat here, telling me that I was destroying the family and that I would regret my selfishness. His face was red with anger, and I saw a side of him that genuinely scared me. This was the brother who had protected me from bullies in school, who had taught me to ride a bike, who had always been my hero. Now he was the bully, and I was his target. I had to threaten to call the police before he finally left, slamming my door so hard that a picture frame fell off the wall and shattered. After that incident, I stopped answering my door unless I was expecting someone. My sister took a different approach. She launched what I can only describe as a social media smear campaign against me. She started posting vague but pointed messages about family betrayal, about greed destroying relationships, about people who pretend to be good while stabbing their loved ones in the back. She never mentioned me by name, but she didn't have to. Our mutual friends and extended family members all knew exactly who she was talking about. She shared inspirational quotes about loyalty and fairness, each one a thinly veiled attack on my character. The worst part was watching people I had known for years, family friends and distant relatives, liking and commenting on these posts with messages of support for her. They had no idea what the real situation was, but they were eager to take sides based on her manipulative narrative. I thought about defending myself publicly, about telling my side of the story, but my therapist advised against it. She said that engaging would only escalate things, and that people who truly knew me wouldn't need an explanation. Still, it hurt. It hurt to see my reputation being torn apart in real time, to watch relationships I valued crumbling because of lies and half-truths. My mother's tactics were more subtle, but equally damaging. She started telling extended family members that I was refusing to help with grandmother's final medical bills and funeral expenses, implying that I was keeping all the inheritance assets for myself, while leaving the financial burden on everyone else. This was completely untrue. I had actually already paid more than my share of those expenses because I wanted to honor grandmother properly, but the truth didn't matter to her. She was crafting a narrative where I was not just greedy, but also heartless and irresponsible. I heard through a mutual family friend that she was telling people I had manipulated grandmother into changing her will in her final days, that I had taken advantage of an elderly woman's declining mental state. The accusation was so hurtful and so far from the truth that it made me physically ill. My grandmother had been sharp as a tack until the very end, and her will had been created years before her death and updated multiple times with the help of her lawyer, always consistent in leaving the house to me. But facts didn't matter when emotions were running high and people wanted someone to blame for their own disappointment. About 2 months after the will reading, I decided I needed to take concrete steps to protect myself legally. I made an appointment with an estate attorney, someone who specialized in inheritance disputes. Walking into that lawyer's office felt surreal, like I was in some television drama rather than living my actual life. The attorney, a woman in her 50s named Margaret who had kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened to my entire story without interruption. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and sighed. She told me that unfortunately, my situation was more common than I might think, that money and property bring out the worst in people, even in families that seem close and loving. She reviewed the will and all the documentation I had brought with me, and she confirmed what I already knew. The will was ironclad. My grandmother had been of sound mind, had used a reputable lawyer, had clearly stated her intentions, and had legally executed all the proper documents. There was no legitimate basis for my family to contest it, but that didn't mean they wouldn't try. Margaret warned me that even frivolous legal challenges could be expensive and emotionally draining to defend against. She recommended that I prepare myself for the possibility of a lawsuit, and that I start documenting all the harassment and threats I was receiving from my family members. She suggested I keep a detailed log of every interaction, save every text message and email, and consider getting a restraining order if the in-person harassment continued. Hearing all of this made the situation feel even more real and frightening. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was potentially heading into serious legal territory, and I needed to protect myself accordingly. I followed Margaret's advice and started keeping meticulous records of everything. I created a folder on my computer where I saved screenshots of my sister's social media posts, copies of threatening text messages from my brother, emails from various family members making demands or accusations. I started writing down dates and times of every interaction, every phone call, every unexpected visit. It felt paranoid and sad to be documenting interactions with my own family, like they were hostile adversaries. But that's exactly what they had become. I also made the difficult decision to change my phone number and only give the new number to a few trusted friends who weren't connected to my family. The constant barrage of calls and texts had been affecting my mental health and my ability to function in my daily life. I couldn't focus at work because I was always anxious about the next attack. I wasn't sleeping well because I would lie awake, worrying about what they might do next. I had developed stress-related health issues, tension headaches, and digestive problems. Something had to change. When my family realized they couldn't reach me on my old number, they escalated again. My father, who had been mostly silent throughout this whole ordeal, finally showed his hand. He sent me a certified letter through his attorney. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The letter stated that he and my mother, along with my siblings, were formally contesting the will on the grounds that my grandmother had been unduly influenced by me and was not of sound mind when she created the final version of her will. They were claiming that I had isolated grandmother from the rest of the family, that I had manipulated her into believing they didn't care about her, and that I had coerced her into leaving me the house. Every single claim was a lie, but they were putting it in legal terms, making it official, making it real. The letter demanded that I agree to mediation to settle the dispute outside of court, and if I refused, they would file a formal lawsuit. Reading that letter from my father's attorney felt like a physical blow to my chest. My hands trembled so badly that I nearly dropped the pages. I had known they were angry, known they felt entitled to the house, but seeing it in official legal language made everything feel horrifyingly real. These people, my own parents, my siblings, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, were actually going through with this. They were willing to drag me through a legal battle, to publicly destroy my reputation, to spend money on lawyers and court fees, all because they couldn't accept that grandmother had made her own choice about her own property. I immediately called Margaret, my attorney, and read her the letter over the phone. She was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then she said something that has stuck with me ever since. She said that sometimes the most painful truths are the ones about the people we love, that discovering someone's true character in a crisis is devastating but also valuable information. She told me that based on everything I had shared with her, my family's claims were baseless and would likely be dismissed if they actually went to court. But that mediation might be a good option because it would be faster, less expensive, and less emotionally traumatic than a full trial. Part of me wanted to fight them in court, to make them publicly acknowledge their lies and manipulation. But another part of me was just exhausted, worn down by months of harassment and stress. I agreed to the mediation, hoping that maybe with a neutral third party present, we could find some resolution that would allow me to keep the house and end this nightmare. The mediation was scheduled for 6 weeks later, which gave me plenty of time to prepare my case, and also plenty of time to spiral into anxiety about facing my entire family in one room. Those 6 weeks were strange. On one hand, there was a temporary cease in the direct harassment because both sides had agreed to let the legal process play out. On the other hand, the silence was almost worse than the constant attacks. I found myself checking my phone obsessively, expecting messages that never came. I would drive past places we used to go as a family and feel this overwhelming sense of loss. I was grieving, not just for my grandmother, but for the family I thought I had, for the relationships that had been revealed as conditional and transactional. I threw myself into preparing for the mediation, with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Margaret and I went through every piece of evidence, organized everything chronologically, prepared responses to every possible argument my family might make. We collected documentation proving that I had not isolated grandmother from the family, including her own calendar that showed regular visits from all family members up until her health declined. We had testimony from her neighbors about how involved she had been in her own affairs, how sharp and independent she had remained. We had statements from her doctor confirming that she had been cognitively sound. We had multiple versions of her will spanning over 10 years, all showing consistent intent to leave the house to me, which proved this wasn't a last-minute decision made under duress. The evidence was overwhelming in my favor, but I knew that logic and facts didn't always matter when emotions were involved. I also did something during this time that was incredibly difficult but necessary for my own peace of mind. I went through grandmother's house, which I still hadn't moved into, and I spent time in every room, remembering. I sat in her favorite chair and tried to feel her presence, tried to understand what she would want me to do. I found old photo albums and looked through pictures of our family during happier times, when we were all genuinely smiling, before money and property had poisoned everything. I found letters she had written to me over the years, birthday cards and notes of encouragement that I had saved. In one of them, written when I was going through a difficult time in college, she told me that I was strong, that I had integrity, and that I should never let anyone, even family, make me compromise my values or my self-worth. It was like she was speaking to me from beyond the grave, giving me permission to stand firm, reminding me that she had chosen me for a reason. I also found something else during one of these visits to the house, something that would end up being crucial in the mediation, though I didn't know it at the time. In grandmother's desk drawer, underneath some old bills and papers, I discovered a journal. It was small, leather-bound, and filled with her handwriting. My heart ached seeing those familiar loops and curves of her penmanship. I almost put it away without reading it, feeling like it was too private, too painful. But something made me open it, and I started reading her entries from the last few years of her life. What I found in those pages both broke my heart and strengthened my resolve. She had written extensively about her decision to leave me the house. She talked about observing all of her children and grandchildren, about noticing who showed up just because they cared and who only came around when they needed something. She wrote about conversations she had overheard when people thought she wasn't listening, discussions about the value of her property, speculation about inheritance. She had known, long before she died, exactly what kind of people some of her family members were. She wrote about feeling lonely sometimes, even when surrounded by family, because she could sense their ulterior motives. But she also wrote about me, about how our time together felt genuine, how I never asked her for anything, how I seemed to value her wisdom and company more than her possessions. She wrote that leaving me the house was not just a gift, but also a test for the family, a way of revealing everyone's true character. Reading that made me cry so hard I thought I might be sick, but it also gave me clarity. She had known this would be difficult. She had known there would be conflict. But she had done it anyway because she trusted me to handle it, because she believed I deserved it, and because she wanted to teach one final lesson about the nature of greed and love. I made copies of the relevant journal entries and gave them to Margaret to include in our mediation materials. These weren't just my claims anymore about grandmother's state of mind and intentions. These were her own words in her own handwriting, clearly articulating her reasoning and her soundness of mind. It was powerful evidence that would be hard for my family to dispute. As the mediation date approached, my anxiety reached new heights. I had nightmares about facing my family, about being ganged up on and overwhelmed by their accusations. I practiced what I would say, how I would stay calm and composed, even if they attacked me. Margaret assured me that the mediator would keep things civil and structured, that I wouldn't be alone in that room, that she would be right there with me advocating for my rights. But still, the thought of seeing my mother's disappointed face, my father's cold eyes, my siblings' angry expressions, it all made me feel physically ill. The night before the mediation, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed, watching the hours tick by on my clock, my mind racing through every possible scenario. Would they be reasonable? Would they apologize? Would they finally see that they were wrong? Or would they double down on their accusations and make everything worse? I thought about calling the whole thing off, about just giving in to their demands to make the pain stop. But then I remembered grandmother's journal, her words about integrity and strength. I remembered why she had chosen me, and I knew I had to see this through, not just for myself, but for her memory, and for the principle of standing up for what's right even when it's hard. The morning of the mediation, I dressed carefully, choosing professional clothing that would make me feel confident and capable. I met Margaret at her office, and we drove to the mediation center together. She gave me last-minute advice about staying calm, about letting her handle the legal arguments, about not letting my family provoke me into saying something I would regret. I nodded along, but internally I was terrified. We arrived at the mediation center, a neutral office building with bland conference rooms designed for exactly this kind of situation. As we walked down the hallway toward our assigned room, I saw them, my entire family, clustered together outside another door, talking in hushed voices. When they saw me, the conversation stopped. The looks they gave me were filled with such hostility that I actually took a step back. My mother turned away entirely, refusing to even make eye contact. My brother's jaw clenched, and my sister crossed her arms defensively. Only my father looked directly at me, and what I saw in his eyes was disappointment and something else I couldn't quite identify. It might have been shame, but I might have been projecting what I wanted to see. The mediator, a man in his 60s named Robert, who had decades of experience in family dispute resolution, welcomed us into the conference room. It was set up with a large table, chairs on both sides, boxes of tissues strategically placed, probably because he had seen many families fall apart in rooms just like this one. He explained the process, how we would each have a chance to present our side, how he would help facilitate discussion, and hopefully guide us toward a resolution that everyone could accept. He emphasized that this was not a court, that he had no power to force a decision, but that his role was to help us find common ground. He seemed kind but firm, and I felt a small measure of comfort knowing he would be keeping things structured. The mediation began with Robert asking my family to present their case first. My father, as the patriarch and the one who had initiated the legal challenge, took the lead. Watching him speak was surreal because this was the man who had read me bedtime stories, who had taught me how to change a tire, who had walked me down the aisle at my wedding, and here he was, sitting across from me, making legal arguments about why I didn't deserve the inheritance his mother had chosen to give me. He spoke in a calm, measured tone that was somehow more hurtful than if he had been yelling. He claimed that in the last years of her life, grandmother had become increasingly dependent on me, that I had isolated her from other family members by scheduling my visits strategically so I would be there alone with her. He said that I had filled her head with negative ideas about the rest of the family, turning her against her own children and other grandchildren. He presented it as if I had engaged in a calculated, long-term manipulation scheme, grooming an elderly woman to favor me in her will. The accusations were so outrageous, so far from the truth of our genuine relationship, that I felt anger rising in my chest like a physical force. Margaret squeezed my hand under the table, a silent reminder to stay calm and let her handle the response. My mother went next, and her presentation was more emotional. She cried as she talked about how hurt she was by grandmother's decision, how she felt it meant her own mother hadn't loved her, how she couldn't understand why she had been passed over in favor of a grandchild. She made herself the victim, completely ignoring the fact that grandmother had left her other meaningful items and that the house decision had nothing to do with loving her children less. She talked about how the family was being destroyed, how holidays would never be the same, placing all the blame on me and on grandmother's supposedly unfair decision. She even suggested that grandmother might have had early dementia that went undiagnosed, grasping at any explanation that didn't require her to accept the simple truth that grandmother had made a conscious, deliberate choice. My siblings each took their turns as well. My brother focused on the financial unfairness, arguing that the house should be considered part of the general estate and divided equally regardless of what the will said. He used terms like equitable distribution and family fairness, trying to make his greed sound like a principled position. My sister was more vicious, bringing up childhood incidents and times when she felt grandmother had favored me, building a case that I had always been manipulating situations to my advantage. She painted me as a conniving, selfish person who had been planning this for years. Listening to their presentations was one of the most painful experiences of my life. These were people who knew me intimately, who knew the truth about my relationship with grandmother, yet they were willing to lie and distort reality to get what they wanted. They were willing to destroy my reputation, to rewrite history, to trample on grandmother's memory and final wishes, all for money and property. The tragedy wasn't just that they were doing this to me. The tragedy was that they apparently believed their own lies. They had convinced themselves that this narrative was true, that I was the villain, because accepting the alternative, that they were greedy and grandmother had simply chosen someone else, was too painful for their egos to handle. When it was my turn to present my case, Margaret started with the legal facts. She methodically went through the documentation, showing that grandmother's will had been properly executed, that she had been of sound mind as verified by her doctor, that she had maintained consistent intentions over many years through multiple versions of her will. She presented testimony from grandmother's neighbors and friends about how independent and sharp she had been until the end. She showed evidence that all family members had continued to have access to grandmother, including dated photographs from family gatherings and grandmother's own calendar with visit schedules. Every claim my family had made was systematically dismantled with facts and evidence. Then Margaret presented grandmother's journal. She read selected entries aloud, and I watched my family's faces as they heard their mother's and grandmother's own words describing her thought process, her observations about the family, her clear and conscious reasoning for her decisions. My mother's face went pale. My father looked down at his hands. My siblings shifted uncomfortably in their seats. These were grandmother's own words, undeniable and clear, explaining exactly why she had made the choices she did. There could be no claim of manipulation or confusion when her own journal entries, written over the course of several years, showed such clarity of thought and consistency of intention. Robert, the mediator, asked if he could examine the journal personally. Margaret handed it to him, and he spent several minutes reading through the entries she had marked. The room was silent except for the sound of pages turning and the ticking of the clock on the wall. I could feel the tension, thick and suffocating, as everyone waited to see what he would say. Finally, he set the journal down and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose in a gesture that suggested he had seen this pattern many times before. He looked at my family and said something that I will never forget. He said that in his decades of mediating family disputes, he had seen many cases where people convinced themselves that a will was unfair or that someone had been manipulated, but that it was rare to have such clear documentation of the deceased person's true intentions and state of mind. He said that grandmother's journal entries showed not only her clarity of thought, but also her awareness that her decision would cause conflict, and her deliberate choice to make it anyway because she believed it was right. Then Robert said something that changed everything. He asked if there were any other documents that hadn't been presented yet, anything else that might be relevant to grandmother's intentions or the family situation. My family's lawyer shuffled some papers and said they had presented everything. Margaret said the same. But then Robert did something unexpected. He said that in his review of the initial documentation provided before the mediation, he had noticed something in the property records for grandmother's house that seemed unusual, and he wanted to clarify it before proceeding. He pulled out a file and started going through property records, tax documents, and title histories. My family looked confused, clearly not understanding where this was going. Even I didn't know what he was talking about. Margaret leaned forward, suddenly very interested. Robert explained that when he had done his due diligence in preparing for the mediation, he had pulled all the public records related to the property to understand its full history and value. What he found was a document that had been filed with the county years ago, a document that most people would overlook, but that had significant legal implications. It was a title modification that grandmother had filed 15 years prior, well before her health had declined, and long before anyone could claim she was under any influence. The document showed that she had legally restructured the property ownership to include a transfer on death designation, specifically naming me as the beneficiary. This was separate from and in addition to the will. It was an earlier, completely independent legal action that demonstrated her long-standing intention to leave me the house. But there was more. Attached to that title modification was an affidavit, a sworn legal statement that grandmother had written and filed, explaining her reasoning for the designation. Robert began reading from this affidavit, and the words seemed to echo through the silent conference room. In the document, grandmother stated that she was making this designation of her own free will, that she was of sound mind, that she was not under any pressure or influence from anyone. She explained that she had observed all of her children and grandchildren carefully over the years and had made her decision based on who had shown genuine care for her rather than interest in her property. But the truly devastating part of the affidavit, the part that made my father close his eyes and my mother cover her mouth, was what came next. Grandmother had written that she was taking this legal step specifically because she anticipated that her children might contest her will, that she had observed their growing interest in her property value as the neighborhood appreciated over the years, and that she wanted to ensure her wishes would be legally protected even if they tried to challenge them. She wrote that she loved all of her children, but that she had noticed a shift in their behavior as she aged, and her assets became more significant. She described feeling like some family members were measuring her worth in dollars, rather than in relationship. She wrote about conversations she had overheard, discussions among her children about what they might inherit, speculation about selling the house after she was gone, debates about how to divide assets. She had heard all of it, understood all of it, and had made her decision accordingly. The affidavit went on to explicitly state that she was leaving the house to me, not only because of my genuine care for her, but also as a statement about values. She wanted to reward kindness over greed, presence over expectation, authentic relationship over transactional interaction. She wrote that she hoped her decision would teach her family something about what truly matters in life, though she was realistic enough to acknowledge that they might not receive the lesson well. She ended the affidavit with a direct statement that any contest to her wishes should be viewed as exactly the kind of greedy behavior she was hoping to discourage, and that she hoped the legal system would honor her clearly stated intentions. The silence in the room after Robert finished reading was deafening. This wasn't just a will that could be contested. This wasn't just a journal with personal thoughts. This was a legal document filed years ago, with sworn statements that anticipated and preemptively countered every argument my family was now making. Grandmother had, in essence, predicted their behavior, and taken steps to protect her wishes from exactly the kind of legal challenge they were now pursuing. She had been far more aware of their character than they ever realized, and she had outsmarted them from beyond the grave. My mother was crying openly now, but these weren't tears of grief or righteous indignation. These were tears of shame and realization. My father sat motionless, staring at the table, probably understanding for the first time that his mother had seen through him, had recognized his growing materialism, and had found him wanting. My siblings looked shell-shocked, their carefully constructed narrative crumbling around them as they confronted their grandmother's actual perception of them, documented in legal records they didn't even know existed. Robert let the silence hang for a long moment, allowing the weight of the revelation to sink in. Then he spoke again, his tone gentle but firm. He said that based on this documentation, in addition to everything else that had been presented, there was absolutely no legal basis for contesting the will. The property had been designated to me through multiple legal mechanisms, all executed years apart, all showing consistent intent, all created when grandmother was undeniably of sound mind and free from any possible influence. Any attempt to continue pursuing this in court would not only be unsuccessful, but could potentially result in legal sanctions for bringing a frivolous lawsuit. He recommended strongly that my family accept the situation as it was legally and morally established. But then Robert did something remarkable that showed why he was so good at his job. Instead of just ending the mediation there with a legal conclusion, he pivoted to address the deeper emotional issues at play. He asked my family if they understood what they had done, not just legally, but morally and emotionally. He pointed out that they had spent months harassing and accusing someone they claimed to love, that they had been willing to destroy their family relationships over property and money, and that in doing so, they had proved exactly what grandmother had written about in her affidavit. Their behavior had validated her decision. He asked them if the house and money were really worth losing their relationships with me, worth tarnishing their mother's memory, worth proving that she had been right about their priorities. He asked them to consider what grandmother would think if she could see how they had treated me, how they had disrespected her final wishes, how they had reduced her life and legacy to a financial transaction. The room was heavy with emotion as Robert's words sank in. He wasn't lecturing them, exactly, but he was holding up a mirror and forcing them to see themselves clearly, perhaps for the first time since this whole situation began. He gave them a chance to take responsibility for their actions, to acknowledge the pain they had caused, to perhaps salvage something from the wreckage of our family relationships. I watched my family members' faces as they processed everything. My mother was still crying, but I could see something shifting in her expression. My father looked older somehow, defeated and tired. My siblings were avoiding eye contact with everyone, including each other. The certainty and righteousness that had fueled their anger for months was gone, replaced by what looked like the beginning of shame and regret. Robert turned to me and asked how I felt about everything that had been presented, about the situation we found ourselves in. It was the first time during the entire mediation that anyone had asked about my feelings, my experience, my pain. I took a shaky breath, trying to organize my thoughts and emotions into coherent words. I told all of them, that the last several months had been the worst of my life. I said that losing my grandmother was devastating enough without simultaneously losing my entire family. I talked about the harassment, the threats, the social media attacks, the isolation, the pain of being treated like a criminal for accepting a gift that was freely and legally given to me. I explained that I had never asked for the house, never manipulated anyone, never done anything except love my grandmother genuinely and show up for her consistently. I said that the cruelest part of this whole experience was discovering that my family's love for me was conditional, that it evaporated the moment their financial expectations weren't met. I told them that they had shown me exactly who they really were, and that grandmother had apparently seen it long before I did. I admitted that there was a part of me that wanted to hear them apologize, that wanted them to acknowledge what they had done and take responsibility for their actions. But I also said that I wasn't sure if any apology could truly repair the damage that had been done, that trust once broken is incredibly difficult to rebuild, especially when the breaking was so deliberate and sustained. I said that I was keeping the house not out of spite or greed, but because it was what grandmother wanted and because giving in to their demands would dishonor her memory and teach the lesson that bullying and harassment work. I explained that the house represented more than just property to me. It represented my grandmother's love, her trust in me, and her hope that I would stand firm in my values even when it was difficult. Then I did something that surprised even myself. I looked at each of them individually and told them what I remembered about our relationships before all of this happened. I reminded my mother of times she had been loving and supportive, told my father about memories of him teaching me important life lessons, recalled moments with my siblings when we had been true friends. I said that I was grieving not just for grandmother, but for the family I thought I had, for the relationships that had been destroyed by greed and entitlement. I told them that I missed them, that I wished things could be different, but that I couldn't and wouldn't sacrifice my integrity or dishonor grandmother's wishes to make them comfortable with their own bad behavior. Have you ever had to stand up to your family when you knew you were right, but they made you feel wrong. Drop a comment below if you've experienced this, because what happened next was something I never expected. Robert gave my family time to respond to everything that had been said and presented. The silence stretched out uncomfortably as they looked at each other, seemingly trying to decide who would speak first or whether anyone would speak at all. Finally, my father cleared his throat and began to talk, his voice rough with emotion. He said that hearing grandmother's affidavit read aloud had been like being punched in the gut, that realizing his own mother had seen through him and found his character lacking was almost unbearable. He admitted that somewhere along the line, he had started thinking about her assets more than her well-being, that he had caught himself calculating the value of the house and what his share might be, and that he was ashamed to recognize that truth about himself. He said that when the will was read and I was given the house, his immediate reaction had been anger and a sense of unfairness, but that he had never stopped to consider that grandmother had the right to do whatever she wanted with her own property, or that perhaps she had good reasons for her choice. He apologized, not just to me but to grandmother's memory, for reducing her legacy to a financial dispute, and for leading the family in this destructive direction. Hearing my father take responsibility was shocking, because he had always been the type of man who rarely admitted fault or showed vulnerability. Tears were streaming down his face as he spoke, and I could see that the shame he felt was genuine. He said he understood if I couldn't forgive him, that he had betrayed my trust and proven himself to be exactly the kind of person grandmother's affidavit described. He acknowledged that he had prioritized money over relationship, property over people, and that the realization of what he had become was forcing him to do some serious self-examination. My mother spoke next, her voice barely above a whisper. She said that she had been jealous of my relationship with grandmother, that she had always felt like she could never live up to her mother's expectations, and that seeing grandmother choose me had triggered all of those old insecurities. She admitted that instead of dealing with her own feelings of inadequacy, she had directed her pain and anger at me, making me the villain so she didn't have to examine her own behavior. She apologized for the cruel things she had said, for the ways she had tried to manipulate other family members against me, and for not being the mother I deserved during this difficult time. She said that she had been so focused on what she didn't receive that she had completely overlooked all the meaningful things grandmother had given her throughout her life, including values and lessons that were worth far more than property. My siblings' apologies were less articulate but seemed equally genuine. My brother admitted that he had been motivated primarily by greed, that he had seen the house as a financial asset rather than as a home full of memories, and that his anger at being excluded from the inheritance had made him behave in ways he was deeply ashamed of now. He apologized for the threatening visits, for the harassment, for making me feel unsafe in my own home. He said he had no excuse for his behavior, and that he would understand if I never wanted to speak to him again. My sister acknowledged that her social media campaign had been cruel and destructive, that she had been trying to punish me publicly because she felt powerless to change the situation legally. She said that jealousy had poisoned her perspective, that she had been competing with me our entire lives in ways I didn't even know about, and that grandmother's choice had been the ultimate confirmation of her worst fears about not being good enough. She apologized for trying to ruin my reputation and for spreading lies about me to people who trusted her. As I listened to these apologies, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me was relieved to finally hear them take responsibility and acknowledge the pain they had caused. Part of me was still angry because apologies don't erase months of harassment and trauma. Part of me was sad because even with the apologies, our relationships would never be the same. The innocence and trust were gone forever. And part of me felt vindicated that grandmother's assessment of the situation had been so accurate, though I took no pleasure in being right about such a painful thing. Robert asked me what I wanted to do with all of this, how I wanted to move forward. I thought about it for a long moment before responding. I said that I appreciated the apologies and that I could see they were genuinely remorseful, but that apologies were just words, and what mattered now was whether their behavior would actually change. I told them that I was keeping the house as grandmother intended and that this was non-negotiable, but that I was open to eventually rebuilding relationships with them if they could respect my boundaries and demonstrate through sustained action that they had genuinely changed. I explained that trust would take a long time to rebuild, and that I needed to see consistent, respectful behavior before I could consider letting them fully back into my life. I also said something that surprised them. I told them that I wanted to honor grandmother's memory by keeping the house in the family, and that when the time was right, I would be open to family gatherings there, to creating new memories in the place where we had shared so many old ones. But I made it clear that this would happen on my timeline and my terms, and only if they could demonstrate that they truly understood why grandmother made the choice she did. I said I wanted the house to be a place of healing eventually, not a constant reminder of our family's ugliest moment. Margaret asked if my family was willing to sign a legal agreement, acknowledging that they would drop all contests to the will and refrain from any future legal challenges or harassment. My family's attorney conferred with them quietly, and after a few minutes they agreed. The paperwork was drawn up right there during the mediation, and one by one my parents and siblings signed away any claims to the property and committed legally to respecting grandmother's wishes as they had been clearly documented through multiple legal instruments. Watching them sign those papers brought me a sense of relief I hadn't felt in months, like a weight I had been carrying was finally being lifted from my shoulders. The mediation ended with Robert commending all of us for being willing to have difficult conversations and for finding a resolution, though he acknowledged that the emotional healing would take much longer than the legal resolution. He suggested that our family might benefit from professional family counseling if we wanted to rebuild our relationships, and he provided referrals to therapists who specialized in family reconciliation after major conflicts. As we all prepared to leave, there was an awkward moment where we all stood in the parking lot, not quite sure how to part ways. My mother stepped forward hesitantly and asked if she could hug me. I tensed up, not sure if I was ready for physical affection from someone who had caused me so much pain, but I also saw genuine remorse in her eyes, and I realized that refusing the hug would set a precedent that might make future reconciliation harder. So I allowed it, though the hug was stiff and uncomfortable. Nothing like the warm embraces we used to share. She whispered, "I'm sorry," again in my ear, and I nodded but didn't say it was okay. Because it wasn't okay. Not yet. My father shook my hand formally, unable to meet my eyes, still clearly drowning in shame. My siblings waved awkwardly from a distance, seeming to understand that they needed to give me space. We didn't make any plans to see each other again, didn't promise to call, didn't pretend that everything was suddenly fine because of some apologies and signed paperwork. The weeks and months following the mediation were a strange period of adjustment and processing. The immediate threat was gone. The legal harassment had ended, and I finally had peace and quiet to actually grieve my grandmother properly and figure out what I wanted to do with the house. The signed agreement from the mediation meant I could move forward without constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attack from my family. But the emotional aftermath was complicated and messy in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. I started seeing a therapist regularly, someone who specialized in family trauma and complex grief. Through our sessions, I began to understand just how much damage the experience had done to my sense of security and trust. I had developed anxiety that manifested in physical symptoms. I was hypervigilant about people's motives, and I found myself questioning whether anyone truly loved me for who I was, or whether all relationships were ultimately transactional. My therapist helped me understand that what I had experienced was a form of betrayal trauma, and that healing would take time and intentional work. She helped me set healthy boundaries, process my grief for both my grandmother and for the family relationships I had lost, and begin to rebuild my sense of self-worth that had been attacked so viciously. I made the decision to move into grandmother's house about 3 months after the mediation. Walking through those rooms as the actual owner, not just a visitor, felt surreal and emotional. Every corner held memories, some joyful, and some now tainted by the conflict over the property. I spent weeks slowly making the space my own, while still honoring grandmother's presence. I kept many of her things, her favorite chair, her collection of teacups, the paintings she loved, but I also added my own touches, updating some rooms, rearranging furniture, bringing in my own belongings. It was a delicate balance of preserving her memory, while also creating a space where I could build my own life and my own future. Some days living in the house felt like a gift, a precious connection to the person who had loved me unconditionally. Other days, it felt like a burden, a constant reminder of what it had cost me in terms of family relationships. I had moments where I walked through the rooms and could almost hear her voice, feel her presence, sense her approval of how I was caring for the place. And I had moments where I sat on the floor and cried, overwhelmed by grief and loneliness and the weight of standing firm in my convictions despite the personal cost. During this time, my family kept their distance, which was both a relief and another source of sadness. They honored the agreement from the mediation. There were no more harassing calls or threatening visits, no more social media attacks or attempts to manipulate other family members. But there was also no real connection, no attempts at genuine reconciliation beyond the apologies that had been made under the mediator's guidance. We existed in a strange limbo, not actively in conflict anymore, but not really in relationship either. About 6 months after the mediation, my mother reached out via email. It was a long, thoughtful message where she expressed again how sorry she was and how much work she had been doing on herself to understand how things had gone so wrong. She told me she had started seeing a therapist, that she was examining her own childhood issues with her mother, her feelings of inadequacy, her tendency to measure worth in material terms. She wasn't asking for anything, wasn't pushing for reconciliation on any timeline. She was just updating me on her personal growth and reiterating that she hoped someday we might be able to rebuild our relationship. I appreciated the email, and after thinking about it for a few days, I responded. I told her I was glad she was doing the internal work necessary to understand what had happened, and that I was also in therapy processing my own trauma from the experience. I said I wasn't ready for regular contact yet, but that I appreciated her respect for my boundaries and her willingness to take responsibility for her actions. We started exchanging occasional emails after that, nothing deep or frequent, just small updates about our lives. A slow and careful rebuilding of connection with no pressure or expectations. My father took longer to reach out, and when he finally did, it was through a handwritten letter that arrived in my mailbox nearly 8 months after the mediation. His handwriting was shaky, and the letter was full of crossed-out words and revisions, showing how difficult it was for him to express himself. He wrote about his own father, my grandfather who had died when I was young, and how he had been raised with very specific ideas about success and worth being tied to financial achievement and property ownership. He talked about how he had internalized those values without questioning them, and how confronting grandmother's affidavit had forced him to examine beliefs he had held his entire life. He said he was ashamed of the man he had become, and that he was trying to figure out how to be better, how to prioritize relationships over possessions, how to measure his worth by different standards. The letter was raw and vulnerable in a way my father had never been before, and reading it made me cry. I wrote back, thanking him for his honesty and sharing some of my own reflections on what family and values really mean. Our correspondence remained infrequent, but became a thin thread of connection between us. My siblings' attempts at reconciliation were less consistent. My brother sent a few apologetic texts early on, but then seemed to disappear into his own life, perhaps too ashamed to maintain contact, or perhaps not willing to put in the sustained effort that real reconciliation requires. My sister made more effort, occasionally commenting positively on social media posts or sending messages on holidays. But there was still a distance between us that neither of us quite knew how to bridge. The wounds she had inflicted with her public campaign against me had cut deep, and while I had intellectually forgiven her, emotionally trusting her again felt impossible. About a year after the mediation, I made a decision that felt important for my own healing. I invited my mother and father to the house for dinner. It was the first time any family member had been back to grandmother's house since her death, aside from the day of the will reading. I was nervous about it for days leading up to the visit, not sure if I was making the right choice or pushing myself into reconciliation before I was ready. But I also felt like I needed to try, needed to see if we could create a new memory in this space that wasn't poisoned by conflict and greed. The evening was awkward at first, everyone overly polite and careful, walking on eggshells and avoiding any topics that might lead to discomfort. We made small talk about weather and current events, danced around anything meaningful. But then, as we sat down to eat at grandmother's old dining table, something shifted. My mother started sharing a memory about a holiday dinner at this very table years ago, and that opened the floodgates for all of us. We spent the next several hours sharing stories about grandmother, laughing at funny memories, crying over touching moments, remembering her not as the source of an inheritance dispute, but as the woman we had all loved. It felt healing in a way I hadn't anticipated, like we were finally grieving together properly, instead of letting the conflict over her property overshadow our love for her. Toward the end of the evening, my father said something that stuck with me. He looked around the dining room, at grandmother's china cabinet and her paintings on the walls, and he said that being in the house made him realize what grandmother had been trying to teach all of them. He said that she hadn't just left me a house, she had left the family a lesson about what really matters, and that the house in my care would serve as a constant reminder of the importance of love over greed, relationship over possession, and authentic connection over transactional interaction. He said he hoped that over time, the house could become a gathering place for the family again, a place where grandmother's values could be remembered and honored, but that he understood it would have to happen slowly and that I got to control that process. I told him I hoped for that too, eventually, but that we had a lot more healing to do first. After they left that night, I sat in grandmother's favorite chair and felt her presence more strongly than I had in a long time. I imagined her looking down on that evening, seeing her family begin the slow process of healing, and I hoped she was proud of me for standing firm in my convictions while also remaining open to eventual reconciliation. I realized that what she had given me wasn't just property or financial security. She had given me the opportunity to learn what real integrity looks like, what it means to honor someone's wishes even when it costs you, and what it takes to stand up for what's right even when everyone around you is telling you you're wrong. Living in the house now, almost 2 years after that devastating will reading, I have mixed feelings about everything that happened. Part of me wishes my grandmother had divided her assets differently, sparing me and the family all of this pain and conflict. But another part of me understands that the conflict revealed important truths that needed to be exposed, that sometimes crisis is necessary for growth and transformation. My family members were forced to confront aspects of their character they had been avoiding, and I was forced to discover strengths I didn't know I had. The relationships I have with my family now are different than they were before. They're more honest in some ways, less performative and superficial. We can't pretend anymore that everything is fine when it's not. We've all seen each other's darkest moments. And there's no going back to the innocent trust we once had. But there's also a foundation now for building something more authentic. Relationships based on genuine respect and conscious choice, rather than just obligation and habit. I still have hard days where I'm angry about what they put me through, where I resent the stress and trauma they caused, where I question whether full reconciliation is even possible or wise. But I also have days where I'm grateful for what I learned, about myself, about them, about what really matters in life. I've learned to set boundaries that protect my peace, to recognize red flags in people's behavior, to trust my own judgment even when others try to manipulate me into doubting myself. I've learned that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their bad behavior, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stand firm in your truth even if it disappoints others. The house itself has become more than just a property to me. It's a symbol of my grandmother's wisdom and foresight, a reminder of the importance of integrity, and a tangible connection to the most unconditional love I've ever experienced. When I walk through the rooms, I try to see them the way she did, as a home filled with memories and meaning rather than just an asset with monetary value. I've started hosting small gatherings there, inviting friends and eventually, occasionally, family members who have genuinely worked on themselves and our relationships. I'm slowly creating new memories in this space, building a life that honors grandmother's legacy while also being authentically my own. Looking back on everything that happened, I can now see patterns and lessons that weren't visible when I was in the middle of the crisis. I understand now that grandmother's decision to leave me the house was about so much more than just property transfer. It was about teaching her family a lesson about values, about revealing character, about showing the difference between genuine love and transactional relationships. She knew her children and grandchildren well enough to predict how they would react, and she made her decision anyway, because she believed the lesson was important enough to risk the family conflict it would cause. That's a sobering thought, that she valued teaching us this truth more than preserving superficial family harmony. I've also come to understand that the mediator finding that affidavit was not just a lucky break or a procedural detail. It was grandmother's final gift to me, her way of protecting me from exactly the kind of legal battle my family launched. She had anticipated their behavior years in advance and had taken concrete steps to shield me from it. She had documented her reasoning, established multiple legal mechanisms for transferring the property, and created a paper trail that would make any legal challenge not just difficult, but ultimately impossible. She had essentially built a fortress around her final wishes, knowing that without those protections, my family might have been able to overwhelm me with legal pressure and force me to give in. The discovery of that document during mediation was the turning point that ended the conflict, but it was a turning point she had engineered long before any of us knew conflict was coming. That level of foresight and protective love still takes my breath away when I think about it. Through this experience, I've learned profound lessons about family, inheritance, and human nature. I've learned that money and property have a way of revealing people's true characters, that the anticipation of inheritance can poison relationships long before anyone actually dies, and that what looks like love and loyalty can sometimes be conditional on financial expectations. I've learned that standing up for what's right is often lonely and painful, that doing the ethical thing doesn't always feel good, and that integrity sometimes costs you relationships you thought were unshakable. But I've also learned that those costs, as painful as they are worth it. I've learned that I'm stronger than I knew, more capable of enduring hardship and standing firm in my convictions than I would have believed before this happened. I've also learned important lessons about forgiveness and reconciliation. I've learned that you can forgive someone without forgetting what they did, that you can hold people accountable while also leaving room for them to grow and change, and that reconciliation is a process that requires sustained effort and genuine transformation, not just apologies and good intentions. I've learned that some relationships can be rebuilt after betrayal, but they will never be exactly the same as they were before, and that accepting that reality is part of the healing process. The new relationships I have with my family members who have done the work to repair things are different, more conscious and intentional, less naive but perhaps more valuable because they're built on truth rather than illusion. I want to talk directly to anyone watching this who might be going through something similar, because I know I'm not alone in experiencing family conflict over inheritance or dealing with the revelation that your family's love was more conditional than you realized. First, I want you to know that your feelings are valid. If you're hurt, angry, betrayed, confused, or any combination of difficult emotions, that's completely understandable, and you're not crazy or overly sensitive. Family betrayal is one of the most painful experiences a person can go through because it violates our most fundamental assumptions about trust and safety. Second, I want to encourage you to stand firm in what you know is right, even when everyone around you is pressuring you to give in. If someone gave you something legally and legitimately, you have every right to keep it. Don't let other people's greed or entitlement make you feel guilty for accepting a gift. The person who gave it to you wanted you to have it, and honoring their wishes is more important than managing other people's disappointment or anger about not getting what they wanted. Third, document everything. Keep records of harassment, threats, and inappropriate behavior. This isn't about being paranoid or vindictive. It's about protecting yourself legally and emotionally. Having documentation can be crucial if things escalate to legal action, and it can also serve as a reality check when people try to gaslight you or rewrite history. Fourth, get professional help. Therapy saved my sanity during this ordeal, and I can't recommend it highly enough. A good therapist can help you process complex emotions, maintain perspective, set healthy boundaries, and develop coping strategies for dealing with family dysfunction. Don't try to handle this kind of situation alone. Fifth, remember that you can't control other people's behavior or choices. You can only control your own responses. You can't make your family members be reasonable, ethical, or loving. You can only decide how you will act and what boundaries you will maintain. Focus your energy on what you can control, rather than trying to change people who have shown you they aren't willing to change. Sixth, be prepared for the possibility that some relationships may not survive this. That's a painful truth, but it's important to accept. Not everyone who claims to love you actually does, at least not in the unconditional way you deserve. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is let go of toxic relationships, even with family members, rather than continuously exposing yourself to their harmful behavior. And finally, remember that this situation, as awful as it is, can ultimately teach you valuable things about yourself, about human nature, and about what really matters in life. You will emerge from this crisis with a clearer understanding of your own strength, your values, and who deserves to be in your inner circle. The lessons are painful, but they're also valuable, and they will serve you well in the future. Before I close this story, I want to talk about what happened with the house itself, beyond just the legal and family dynamics. About 18 months after the mediation, I decided to do some renovations, updating the kitchen and bathrooms while keeping the overall character of the home that grandmother had loved. During the kitchen renovation, the contractors discovered something hidden behind a cabinet that had been built into the wall. It was a small metal box, carefully sealed and tucked away, where it would only be found if someone was doing major work on the house. Inside that box was a letter addressed to me in grandmother's handwriting, along with some old photographs and a few pieces of jewelry I had never seen before. The letter explained that she had hidden this box years ago, hoping that someday when I owned the house and made it my own, I would find it. She wrote that she wanted me to know she had complete faith in my ability to handle whatever challenges came from her decision to leave me the house. She said she knew her children well enough to predict there would be conflict, and she wanted to leave me this message of support and encouragement for when I most needed it. She told me she was proud of me, not just for the person I was, but for the person she knew I would become through facing and overcoming adversity. She wrote that the most important inheritance she could give me wasn't property or money, but the lesson that standing firm in your integrity is always worth the cost, even when that cost is high. Finding that letter in the middle of the renovation, at a point where I was actively making the house my own, while still honoring her memory, felt like receiving a hug from beyond the grave. It reminded me that she had thought all of this through carefully, that her decision had been deliberate and well considered, and that she had tried to prepare me as best she could for the difficult journey I would face. The photographs in the box were of her as a young woman, images I had never seen before, showing her vibrant and full of life. and the jewelry included pieces that had belonged to her own grandmother, items with sentimental value far beyond their monetary worth. She had saved these specifically for me, knowing they would mean something special because of their history and the connection they represented across generations. I had the letter framed and hung it in the house where I can see it regularly. On difficult days, when I'm still processing the pain of family betrayal or questioning whether I made the right choices, I read her words again and feel strengthened by her confidence in me. That letter is perhaps the most valuable thing she left me, more precious than the house itself, because it's a tangible reminder that at least one person in my life loved me purely and believed in me completely. So now, 2 years after that awful day when the will was read and my family turned on me, I'm living in grandmother's house, building a life that honors her values and her memory. The relationships with my family are slowly, tentatively healing, though they will never be what they once were. I've learned hard lessons about human nature, about the corrosive power of greed, and about the strength required to stand alone when everyone around you is wrong. I've discovered reserves of courage and integrity I didn't know I possessed. And I've found that sometimes the most loving thing someone can do is give you a gift that will force you to grow, even if that growth is painful. I hope that by sharing my story, I've helped someone out there who is going through something similar feel less alone. I hope I've shown that it's possible to survive family betrayal, to stand firm in your convictions even when it costs you dearly, and to eventually find peace and purpose in the aftermath of conflict. And I hope I've honored my grandmother's memory and her final wishes by refusing to let greed and manipulation win, by maintaining my integrity even when it was hard, and by learning the lessons she so carefully orchestrated through her decisions. If this story resonated with you, if you've experienced family conflict over inheritance or discovered that people you trusted had hidden agendas, I want you to know that you're not alone and your experience matters. Please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or your own experiences. Understanding the content of stories like this is so important because these situations are far more common than people realize, and talking about them openly helps break the shame and isolation that often accompany family dysfunction. If this story touched your heart or helped you feel validated in your own difficult family situation, please leave a like on this video. It helps the YouTube algorithm share this content with others who might need to hear it. And please subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales for more stories about real human experiences, about the complexity of family relationships, about standing up for what's right even when it's hard. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you don't miss future stories that might speak to your own experiences or help you understand the experiences of others. Remember, the most powerful thing we can do is share our truths, learn from each other's experiences, and support one another through the difficult realities of being human in a complicated world. Thank you for listening to my story, for taking the time to understand what I went through, and for being part of a community that values authenticity over pretense and truth over comfortable lies. Until next time, take care of yourselves, honor your own integrity even when it's costly, and remember that you deserve relationships built on genuine love rather than conditional acceptance.